It started with a kid from Bensonhurst riding beside his father in a coal truck, watching the city with sharp eyes that missed nothing. No one knew that boy would grow into one of the most feared enforcers in Mafia history, a man who carried out murders by day and slipped into FBI meetings by night. His name was Greg Scarpa, and for 3 decades he lived a life built on violence, secrets, and a deal with the government that would shake the Bureau to its core. This is the story of the Grim Reaper, and the truth he took with him to the grave. It began long before the headlines, before the Colombo family, before anyone in Brooklyn whispered the name Greg Scarpa with fear in their voice. May 8th, 1928. A newborn cries somewhere in New York City, in a neighborhood where the greats spit steam and the tenements lean in on each other like old men trading secrets. His parents, Salvatore and Mary Scarpa, had come from Italy with the same dream as every immigrant who stepped onto American soil. A steady job, a roof that didn't leak, and a chance for their children to climb a little higher than they ever could. They settled in Bensonhurst, a working-class pocket of Brooklyn where you could smell bread baking from the corner bakeries and hear 3 languages on a single block. The Depression hit that neighborhood hard. Every dollar had a job, and every kid learned early that you pulled your weight or someone else went hungry. Greg was one of those kids. Small frame, sharp eyes, already watching the world like he was taking notes. His father delivered coal around the city, a cold, back-breaking trade, and Greg rode with him, covered in soot before most boys his age were even awake. They hauled black sacks up narrow stairwells and into cramped apartments where families huddled around dying heat. Those early mornings taught him the value of toughness and the importance of keeping your mouth shut and your eyes open. He saw how the streets worked. He saw who held power and who pretended to. And in a neighborhood like Bensonhurst, the lines between survival and something darker were thinner than anyone liked to admit. Before he ever picked up a gun, before he ever became the Grim Reaper, Greg Scarpa was a Depression-era kid riding beside his father in a coal truck, learning that the world didn't give you much, so you took what you could. By the time the 1950s rolled in, the country was shaking off the shadows of the war. But Brooklyn still carried its own quiet tensions. The old neighborhoods hadn't changed much since Greg Scarpa's childhood. The bakeries still opened before dawn, the corner clubs still buzzed after midnight, and the men who really ran things rarely raised their voices. Somewhere in that mix, Greg's older brother, Salvatore Jr., opened a door that would define the rest of his life. The Colombo crime family wasn't just a crew with fast money and sharp suits. It was a whole system built on loyalty, fear, and the kind of discipline you didn't learn in school. Greg stepped into that world with the same focus he'd shown hauling coal as a kid. Only now, the stakes were higher and the rewards came faster. He married Connie Forrest, a woman who tried her best to build a normal life around a man who was drifting deeper into the underworld. Together, they had 4 children, 1 daughter and 3 sons. And for a while, Greg moved between 2 worlds. Breakfast with his family, then business with men who spoke in half sentences and shook hands only after checking the room. But the life at home didn't quiet the hunger he carried. In the back rooms of social clubs and storefronts, he was learning how money flowed, how violence settled disputes, and how a man earned respect when laws didn't matter. By the end of the decade, he wasn't just another face in the Colombo family, he was becoming someone they relied on. And then, there was Linda Shiro. She entered his life in a way that wasn't loud or dramatic, just steady. A long-term presence who seemed to understand the parts of him he didn't show to many people. Their relationship stretched over 30 years, overlapping with his marriage, his criminal rise, and everything that came after. They had 2 children together, and Linda would eventually become one of the few people who truly knew what Greg Scarpa was doing in the shadows. On the surface, he was a husband and father. Underneath, he was a young mobster learning the rules of a violent trade, building the foundation for the fearsome reputation that would follow him for decades. By the late 1950s, Greg Scarpa wasn't just another soldier earning his way. He was becoming the kind of man other mobsters watched carefully, the kind you didn't cross unless you had a death wish. The Colombo family used him wherever the work demanded a steady hand and a cold heart. Gambling rackets, Shylock loans, extortion jobs, hijackings off the docks, counterfeit runs, narcotics deals. Scarpa moved through all of it with a calm that unsettled even seasoned wise guys. He wasn't loud, he didn't boast, he simply acted, and the message spread on its own. What set him apart wasn't just the range of crimes he handled, It was the violence that followed him like a shadow. When someone needed to disappear, Greg was the man you sent. When a problem needed to be resolved permanently, he handled it with the same efficiency he'd shown delivering coal as a kid. Only now, he wasn't hauling sacks, he was hauling bodies. The whispers started first, then the nickname, the Grim Reaper. It wasn't poetic, it was literal. Men who crossed him had a habit of turning up dead, and Scarpa did little to hide the toll it took on his conscience. He reportedly stopped counting at 50. After that, the number didn't matter. With the money came the lifestyle. He kept an apartment on Sutton Place in Manhattan where the view was clean and the nights were quiet enough to make a man forget what he did for a living. He owned homes in Brooklyn, Staten Island, Las Vegas, and Singer Island in Florida, far-flung escapes for a man who rarely slowed down long enough to enjoy them. But his true headquarters was local, the Wimpy Boys Social Club. From the outside, it looked like any other neighborhood hangout, a place with mismatched chairs, stale coffee, and a radio murmuring in the corner. Inside, it was Scarpa's command center. Deals were made there, alliances formed, grievances settled. His crew operated out of that cramped room, and some of the future heavyweights of the Colombo family came up under his watch. People called him stylish, even charming. But beneath that smooth exterior was a man who knew how to pull strings, pressure rivals, and keep the streets in line. By the early 1960s, Scarpa wasn't simply rising through the ranks. He was carving out a reputation that would echo through every corner of New York's underworld. By 1962, Greg Scarpa had built a reputation most men in the mob either feared or admired. But even the most seasoned enforcers make mistakes, and that year the law finally caught up to him. It started with an armed robbery. Not the biggest job he'd ever been part of, not even the most violent, but it was enough. Federal agents moved in on him outside his home, the kind of quiet grab designed to rattle a man without giving him time to think. They brought him in, sat him under fluorescent lights, and waited for the pressure to do its work. Scarpa already knew what jail felt like. He'd spent a little time here and there, and he despised every second of it. A cell wasn't just confinement, it was boredom, exposure, and weakness. And weakness was something he'd spent his entire adult life burying deep. The FBI understood that. They also understood the value of a man like Scarpa. He had access to the streets, influence over violent crews, and a ruthless streak that made him both effective and unpredictable. Most agents avoided men like him, a few saw an opportunity, so when they slid the deal across the table, Scarpa didn't hesitate long. Cooperate and walk out. Refuse and face a case that could put him away for years. He chose the door. With that decision, a new chapter began, one he would never admit publicly, one the Bureau would guard closely, and one that would complicate every murder, every alliance, every move he made from that day forward. Greg Scarpa became a confidential informant, hidden behind the same violence that made him valuable. The mob saw a loyal enforcer. The FBI saw a weapon they could aim without getting their hands dirty. It was the start of a relationship built on secrets, manipulation, and mutual need. A relationship that would span decades and leave a trail of bodies, lies, and corruption behind it. The summer of 1964 was already heavy with violence when the FBI called Greg Scarpa back into their orbit. 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, had vanished in Mississippi. The Bureau knew the Klan had killed them, but they didn't know where the bodies were buried. Every search came up empty, and the pressure on Washington was growing by the hour. So the FBI reached for a tool they weren't supposed to use. They flew Scarpa into Mississippi under the kind of secrecy usually reserved for covert operations. No paperwork, no fingerprints, no official record that a Mafia hitman was being deployed on American soil to do what federal agents could not. He checked into a hotel with Linda DeVecchio, who traveled with him, oblivious at first to what the Bureau expected him to do. Then an agent slipped into the room, handed Scarpa a gun, and left without a word. That was the signal. Scarpa changed clothes, left money on the dresser, and walked out the door with the calm of a man heading to a job he'd done 100 times. He knew exactly who he needed to find. Lawrence Bird, a local TV salesman who lived a quiet life above the counter and a violent one beneath it. A secret Klansman who moved in the same circles as the men responsible for the killings. The story that survives, the one Linda DeVecchio later told, the one the FBI has never confirmed or denied, goes like this. Scarpa approached Bird as he carried a television set to his car. He offered help, caught him off guard, and forced him into a vehicle. From there, he brought him to a secluded spot, pressed a gun into his mouth, and made the consequences clear. Federal agents had spent weeks asking politely. Scarpa asked differently. Bird broke. Whether out of fear or certainty, he gave up the location of the bodies. The truth came out in a burst of panic, the kind only a man staring down death can produce. When Scarpa returned to the hotel, he handed the gun back to the FBI agent and accepted a wad of cash. Then he and Linda boarded a flight home to New York as if they'd done nothing more than cut a short vacation short. Days later, the bodies of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were found buried in an earthen dam. The country mourned. The Bureau claimed victory, and the man who made it possible faded back into the shadows of Brooklyn, protected by a secret that would follow him for the rest of his life. 2 years after the Mississippi burning case, Greg Scarpa found himself once again pulled into the racial violence tearing through the South. January 1966, Vernon Dahmer, a respected civil rights leader and businessman, was murdered when the Ku Klux Klan firebombed his home. It was another act of terror, another message meant to silence a man who fought for the right to vote. The FBI was under pressure, the kind that made agents look for shortcuts, and shortcuts usually led them back to the same place, Greg Scarpa. Despite the risks, despite the secrecy, the Bureau reached out again. Scarpa agreed, knowing exactly what they needed from him. They weren't asking for interviews or quiet persuasion. They were asking for the kind of interrogation no agent could put in a report. He traveled to Mississippi for the second time and the pattern repeated itself. A target was identified. A private abduction followed. Scarpa delivered the same violent message he'd sent in 1964. Talk or don't come home. And once again, the information he extracted helped break open the case. But something shifted after that operation. Scarpa expected payment, not a bonus, not a thank you, but the amount he believed he'd earned for risking his life in a state where a mobster from Brooklyn had no allies and no cover. The FBI pushed back. They wanted his work without the price tag. Maybe they thought he owed them. Maybe they thought he wouldn't walk away. They misjudged him. The disagreement wasn't loud or public. It didn't end in threats or leverage. It ended in silence. Scarpa cut contact, shut the door, and went back to the Colombo family, a world where deals were honored even if they were violent. The Bureau filed him away as a former asset, a man they'd used twice and didn't intend to use again. For the next several years, Scarpa stayed out of the FBI's reach. But the relationship wasn't finished. It was only paused, waiting for a new agent, a new era, and a new level of corruption that would pull him back into the shadows with far higher stakes. From 1975 to 1980, Greg Scarpa lived as though the FBI had never existed. No agents stopping by, no late-night calls, no envelopes of cash exchanged in parking lots. The relationship that had once operated in the shadows went silent, buried under the weight of that last argument over money and power. Scarpa didn't dwell on the break. He returned fully to the life he understood, the world of the Colombo family, where hierarchy and violence shaped every decision. He was still a capo, still running his crew, still moving money through gambling rooms, loan operations, hijacked shipments, and whatever else the family needed handled. These were years when Scarpa solidified his reputation inside the organization. He didn't posture, he didn't ask for attention, he simply worked, and the work spoke for him. Younger soldiers watched him as an example of how a man climbed through the ranks without ever looking shaken. Older men trusted him because he had a talent for survival, the kind that kept a crew steady through quiet years and turbulent ones. He lived well. Sutton Place, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Florida, Las Vegas. His properties remained part of the image, proof that his loyalty to the family paid dividends. But money wasn't the measure of his power. What mattered was that when Scarpa spoke, people moved. When he gave an order, it didn't circle back with questions. These 5 years were a lull, but not a peaceful one. Inside the Colombo family, tension always simmered. Alliances shifted, grudges burned under the surface. Scarpa watched it all with the detachment of a man who had seen enough to know how quickly things could unravel. The FBI might have believed their break with him was permanent, but Scarpa's world had a way of looping back on itself, and soon a new agent would step into his life. A man whose ambition and moral decay would pull Scarpa back into federal orbit and leave a trail of destruction neither of them could control. By 1980, the FBI had a new face on the Colombo squad, an agent named Lindley DeVecchio, a man with a quiet demeanor and ambitions that didn't always line up with Bureau protocol. He knew who Greg Scarpa was. He knew the history, the silence, the bad blood left from Mississippi, and he believed he could reopen a door most agents thought was sealed shut. DeVecchio reached out carefully, almost personally, building trust where other agents had failed. Scarpa had no interest in becoming a government asset again. He didn't like the rules, didn't like the debts, didn't like the idea that anyone in law enforcement might think they owned a piece of him. But DeVecchio kept pressing. He spoke to Scarpa the way a man speaks to someone he respects, not someone he's trying to control. And slowly the walls came down. Scarpa agreed to return as an informant, though the arrangement didn't look anything like the typical FBI playbook. DeVecchio didn't keep him at arm's length. He didn't follow the standard protocol of meetings in public places and discreet exchanges. Their relationship drifted into something different, something that blurred the line between agent and criminal. He visited Scarpa's homes, sometimes sitting down to dinner with Linda Shiro and the children. He accepted gifts, jewelry, cash, even a rare Cabbage Patch doll at one point, the kind of present a man gives to someone he considers more than a work partner. And in return, he provided Scarpa with something far more valuable than money: information, names of rivals, movements of competing factions, rumors circulating inside federal investigations, details that, in the wrong hands, could get people killed. Scarpa didn't waste any of it. He treated DeVecchio's intelligence like ammunition, a resource he could use to protect himself and strengthen his grip inside the family. People whispered that the relationship wasn't just inappropriate, it was dangerous. Tradecraft had turned into favoritism. Case files had turned into privilege. An FBI agent was feeding a mob killer the kind of knowledge that shifted power on the street. Inside the Bureau, some agents began to notice the closeness, the private meetings, the strange ease with which Scarpa seemed to avoid prosecution. Questions were raised, complaints filed, but nothing stuck. DeVecchio kept his position, and Scarpa kept his pipeline of federal secrets. What began as a renewed informant relationship was becoming something far darker, a partnership that would shape the violence of the decade and push both men toward a collision that neither could walk away from clean. Through the 1980s, Greg Scarpa walked a tightrope that most mobsters never survived. He was a capo in the Colombo family, feared for his violence, respected for his discipline, and at the same time he was quietly feeding information to the FBI. Not the kind that took down bosses or shattered criminal empires. His reports were uneven, sometimes helpful, sometimes little more than scraps. But they were enough to keep the Bureau interested and, more importantly, enough to keep DeVecchio invested in him. The FBI paid Scarpa for what he brought in. Over the years, the money added up, though it was pocket change compared to what he made on the street. The real value for Scarpa wasn't in the envelopes, it was in the protection. He moved through investigations with an ease that puzzled fellow mobsters. Cases that should have stuck somehow slipped away. Raids landed on other crews, not his. His name came up, then vanished from paperwork like a ghost. Then, in 1985, the whole arrangement became too visible to ignore. Scarpa was indicted for running a major credit card scam, the kind of federal case that normally came with a stiff sentence. Prosecutors pushed for prison time, eager to make an example out of a man who had been evading the law for decades. But DeVecchio stepped in. He wrote a memo to the judge outlining Scarpa's assistance to the Bureau over the years. He framed him not as a predator, but as a contributor, a man who had given federal law enforcement meaningful support. The judge listened. Instead of prison, Scarpa walked out with 5 years of probation and a modest fine. No cell, no bars, no cut-in status. It was the kind of outcome that made other wise guys stare at him with questions they didn't dare ask aloud. Inside the Colombo family, suspicion began to thicken. Nobody gets a federal indictment dropped to probation unless something unusual is happening behind closed doors. Men whispered in social clubs, trading theories about how Scarpa kept beating cases. Some said he was untouchable, others said he was lucky, and a few, the ones with sharper instincts, started to suspect the truth that the Grim Reaper had a friend in law enforcement. Scarpa knew the danger of these whispers. In the Mafia, a hint of betrayal could be a death sentence. But he carried himself the same way he always had. Direct, controlled, unfazed. And with DeVecchio feeding him information, he believed he could navigate whatever storms were coming. What neither man understood at the time was that this partnership, built on back-channel deals, hidden favors, and shared secrets was setting the stage for the bloodiest chapter in Colombo family history. In 1986, Greg Scarpa's world shifted in a way no enemy, no indictment, no street feud had ever managed. It happened quietly, without violence, inside the sterile walls of Victory Memorial Hospital in Brooklyn. Scarpa was rushed in for emergency ulcer surgery. The operation itself wasn't the danger, the real risk came afterward when he needed blood. The hospital had a full supply ready, but Scarpa refused it. Years of living in the underworld had filled him with a deep mistrust of anything he couldn't verify himself. If blood was going into his body, it had to come from people he knew. So the call went out to family members and associates. Men loyal to him, men who owed him, men who understood that when Greg Scarpa asked for something, there was only one answer. They lined up, offering donations without hesitation. Among them was Paul Mele, a bodybuilder, mob associate, and steroid user who didn't know, or didn't admit, that a dirty needle had already altered his own blood. He gave his blood. The doctors transfused it, and without realizing it, they delivered something far more deadly than any internal bleeding. The infection didn't announce itself right away. Scarpa left the hospital believing the danger had passed. He returned to his homes, his clubs, his operations. He acted as though everything was under control because control was something he had spent his entire life mastering. But the virus was there, working its way through him. By the time the truth surfaced, it was too late. Scarpa had contracted the human immunodeficiency virus, an illness he would spend the rest of his life hiding behind a cover story of cancer. In the mob, weakness could be fatal, and Scarpa was determined that nobody, not rivals, not allies, not even some family members, would see vulnerability in him. The Grim Reaper had built his reputation on other men's deaths. Now something invisible was stalking him, and for once, he had no way to intimidate it, threaten it, or force it to give up information. This was the beginning of his final decline, though nobody on the street knew it yet. By 1991, the Colombo family was tearing itself apart. What started as a quiet power struggle between the imprisoned boss, Carmine Persico, and acting boss Victor Orena erupted into a street war that turned Brooklyn into a battlefield. Soldiers vanished. Social clubs emptied out. Everybody watched their mirrors, wondering who would make it home and who wouldn't. Greg Scarpa wasn't just another player in this fight. He was Persico's most feared enforcer, a man whose loyalty ran deep and whose reputation made even seasoned killers uneasy. Orena knew that as long as Scarpa was alive, Persico's faction had a blade they could swing at any moment. So the Arena crew made a decision. They would strike first. On November 18th, 1991, Scarpa was driving through Brooklyn with his 22-year-old daughter Linda behind him in another car, her infant son strapped into the back seat. It was supposed to be an ordinary drive, the kind of moment where family life briefly interrupts the violence waiting outside. Then the trap closed. 2 cars boxed him in, doors flew open. Gunmen ran toward him with weapons drawn, ready to finish the job and send a message to every Persico loyalist still standing. Scarpa reacted with the reflexes of a man who'd lived too long in the crosshairs. He slammed the accelerator, smashing into anything blocking his path, metal screeching against metal as pedestrians dove out of the way. Bullets flew, bystanders were injured, and somehow, through speed, rage, and a lifetime of survival instincts, Scarpa and his family escaped. He wasn't shaken, he was enraged. The attempt on his life changed the entire rhythm of the war. Scarpa took it personally, not because they came for him, but because they came for him while his daughter and grandson were close enough to die. From that moment on, he prowled Avenue U with a vengeance, cruising past bars, clubs, and street corners where Arena loyalists gathered. He searched for the man who had organized the ambush, William Coutelot, and anyone else who had stood behind Arena's push for control. What followed was a streak of killings that marked some of the bloodiest weeks of the Third Colombo War. Scarpa and his crew hunted down targets with the cold precision he was known for. Thomas Amato, a Genovese associate linked to Arena, Rosario Nastasa, Vincent Fusaro, James Malpiso. Each man was taken off the board one by one. Fusaro was reportedly shot while he was hanging Christmas lights on his house, a reminder that Scarpa didn't wait for perfect conditions. He struck whenever the opportunity appeared. Illness had weakened his body, but not his resolve. Even with HIV consuming him from the inside, he operated as though the war was the only thing keeping him upright. The Grim Reaper worked overtime, and everyone in Brooklyn felt it. The streets were reaching a breaking point, and Scarpa, half blind to his own decline, was still steering the violence with a steady hand. By 1992, the years of violence and secrecy were starting to show on Greg Scarpa. The illness he kept hidden behind the word cancer was grinding him down, but he refused to let anyone outside his inner circle see how much it had taken from him. In courtrooms and social clubs, he still carried himself like the same man who'd run crews and settled scores without blinking. That year, a rare moment of justice landed in his favor. After tracing his HIV infection back to the 1986 blood transfusion, Scarpa filed a civil lawsuit against the surgeon and Victory Memorial Hospital. The case cut open a part of his life he didn't want anyone examining, but he pushed it forward anyway. In August 1992, the court ruled in his favor, $300,000. It wasn't about the money, it was about blame, and Scarpa wanted someone to answer for what was happening inside him. But his brief victory didn't last. While appearing in a New York courtroom for the civil proceedings, state authorities moved in on him. They arrested him on a firearms charge, the kind of detail that may have seemed small to outsiders, but carried weight in his world. Weapons were part of his daily life. Having one at the wrong time or in the wrong place could give prosecutors all the leverage they needed. It wasn't a dramatic takedown. No chase, no shootout, just officers closing in, placing him in cuffs and leading him out of a room where moments earlier he'd stood as a plaintiff instead of a defendant. In the eyes of the law, Scarpa was never far from trouble. One courtroom fight ended with a settlement. Another opened the door to a new series of charges. The walls were closing in. The Colombo War had thinned out his allies. His body was failing him. And the FBI connection that once shielded him from consequences was fraying under its own corruption. Scarpa had spent decades controlling the violence around him. Now the consequences were coming from every direction. The courts, the street, and the disease crawling through his blood. Late 1992 found Greg Scarpa in a place he never expected, stuck inside his own home. Wearing an electronic monitoring bracelet, forced to sit still while the world outside kept turning violent. House arrest didn't suit a man like him. He paced, he watched, he listened. And then the trouble came right to his doorstep. The spark was his son, Joey. Word reached Scarpa that two Lucchese associates, Michael DeRosa and Ronald Moran, had threatened him over a drug deal gone bad. In the underworld, a threat against a son is a threat against the father, and Scarpa didn't let those slide. Illness or not, bracelets or not, he wasn't going to sit in bed while someone took aim at his bloodline. So he got up. Still recovering, still weak, he climbed out of bed and told Joey to get in the car. They drove straight to DeRosa's place, Scarpa ignoring the rules of his confinement as though they were suggestions, not conditions. He didn't knock. He didn't negotiate. He opened fire. Chaos took over the scene in seconds. DeRosa went down under Scarpa's shots, wounded but alive. Moran returned fire, hitting Scarpa directly in the eye. It was the kind of wound that would have ended most men on the spot, but Scarpa didn't collapse. He staggered back into the car, blood pouring down his face, and told his son to drive. Back home, half blind and still bleeding, he did something that said everything about who he was. He poured scotch into the wound, a crude attempt to clean it before the authorities showed up. When law enforcement reached the house, Scarpa insisted everything was fine, as if a bullet to the eye were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The truth was far more serious. The damage cost him the eye, pushing his health even deeper into a downward spiral. And the moment investigators pieced together what had happened, the leniency he'd been granted vanished. House arrest was revoked. He was taken into custody, weakened but still dangerous, his influence shrinking but not yet erased. The Grim Reaper had survived another shootout, but this time he paid a price even he couldn't hide behind dark glasses or bravado. By 1993, Greg Scarpa looked like a man carved down by time, illness, and decades of violence. The swagger was still there, buried somewhere beneath the hollow cheeks and the dark glasses. But his body couldn't keep pace with the reputation he'd spent a lifetime building. The government knew it, his enemies knew it, and Scarpa knew it most of all. That year, federal prosecutors brought a racketeering case against him, a heavy one, built on 3 murders and a conspiracy to commit several more. These weren't street-level charges. This was the kind of indictment designed to seal a man away forever, to close the book on someone who had eluded real punishment for half a century. Scarpa didn't fight it. On May 6, 1993, he stood in court and pleaded guilty. No theatrics, no angry speeches. The man who once stared down rivals without blinking now faced the federal bench with the cold acceptance of someone who understood the math. His health was deteriorating. His alliances were strained. The FBI channel that had shielded him for years had collapsed under scrutiny. The walls he'd dodged his entire life had finally closed. In December, the sentence came down: life in federal prison, a term as heavy as the crimes he'd committed. But even that wasn't the end of the negotiation. His condition, the HIV infection that had advanced into AIDS, had left him frail, nearly blind in one eye, and physically broken. The Bureau of Prisons eventually reduced his sentence to 10 years, not as an act of mercy, but as an acknowledgement that the disease would finish the job long before any parole date ever came. For a man who had ruled social clubs and street corners with force, who had shaped wars inside one of New York's most violent families, the final punishment wasn't a bullet or a rival's betrayal. It was a quiet cell and a failing body, a slow decline for someone who had spent his entire life outrunning consequences. Greg Scarpa had always believed he could bend the world to his will. In 1993, the world finally stopped bending. In the final stretch of Greg Scarpa's life, the violence, the power plays, the secrets he carried for the FBI, all of it faded beneath the weight of a disease he could no longer hide. By 1994, he was a shell of the man who once walked into social clubs and silenced rooms with nothing more than his presence. The Grim Reaper, the enforcer everyone feared, now moved slowly through the corridors of the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota. Guards who knew his history watched him with a mix of caution and disbelief. This was the man who had prowled Avenue U looking for rivals. This was the man who'd survived ambushes, raids, and wars. AIDS had done what bullets, betrayals, and prison couldn't. It stripped him down inch by inch. He tried to mask the decline for as long as he could. He told people he had cancer. He wore sunglasses to hide the damage to his eye. He carried himself with whatever remained of his old confidence. But inside that medical unit, there was no one left to impress, no crew to lead, no enemies to intimidate, just nurses, doctors, and federal guards watching the end of a life built on force. On June 4th, 1994, it was over. Greg Scarpa died quietly, far from the streets that had defined him, far from the family he'd fought to protect and the enemies he'd hunted without hesitation. No shootout, no final act of defiance, just a man lying in a medical bed, claimed by the very blood that had once carried so much fear. For decades, he had taken lives without hesitation. In the end, there was nothing left to take but his own. The voice he carried through the underworld, the violence he wielded, the secrets he kept, all of it ended in that sterile room in Minnesota. The Grim Reaper finally met the one force he couldn't control. Death didn't close the book on Greg Scarpa. In some ways, it opened it wider. The secrets he kept, the ones buried beneath FBI memos, closed-door meetings, and a relationship that never should have existed, began leaking into daylight almost as soon as he was gone. In 1995, during the racketeering trials of the Arena faction, the truth surfaced in open court. A former Colombo consigliere turned government witness, Carmine Sessa, revealed what the FBI had kept hidden for decades. Greg Scarpa, one of the most violent enforcers in the Mafia, had been an informant, not occasionally, not reluctantly, but for years. To the men who had fought beside him and against him, it was like learning a ghost had been living in their house. Some refused to believe it. Others saw the pieces fall into place, the cases Scarpa walked away from, the indictments that evaporated, the way he always seemed one step ahead when other crews weren't so lucky. But the revelations didn't stop. Questions began swirling around Lindley DeVecchio, the FBI agent who had handled Scarpa through the 1980s and early 90s. The closeness of their relationship, the dinners, the gifts, the private meetings, no longer looked like sloppy informant work. It looked like corruption. Defense attorneys for Arena's men argued that Scarpa had been given intelligence that he used to carry out murders during the Third Colombo War. If that were true, then the entire narrative of the conflict shifted. Killings that prosecutors painted as cold-blooded executions might have been reclassified as survival. Retaliation driven by information law enforcement never should have supplied. The pressure built for years. By 2006, the situation reached a breaking point. DeVecchio was indicted on charges tying him to 4 murders, accused of feeding Scarpa the names of rivals who ended up dead. It was a case unlike anything the Bureau had faced, an FBI agent standing trial for aiding a Mafia hitman. But the prosecution had a fragile foundation. Linda DeVecchio, Scarpa's longtime girlfriend and the one person who had witnessed more of his private life than anyone else. For a moment, her testimony threatened to expose the full extent of the relationship between Scarpa and DeVecchio. Then, it collapsed. A decade-old interview surfaced contradicting key parts of her story. Credibility evaporated. Without her, the case fell apart. On November 1st, 2007, prosecutors requested dismissal, and the judge wiped DeVecchio's slate clean. The accusations remained, but legally he walked away untouched. By then, Scarpa had been dead for 13 years, but his ghost lingered in overturned convictions, in damaged careers, in courtroom arguments about where law enforcement ended and criminal influence began. The man who lived his life in shadows had left enough behind to stain the FBI long after he was gone. After Greg Scarpa's death, the streets didn't go quiet, and neither did the legacy he left behind. His family carried pieces of that life with them, some by choice, some by force. And none carried more than his son, Gregory Scarpa Jr. Where his father operated with cold precision and an uncanny instinct for survival, Scarpa Jr. moved through the underworld with a rougher edge. He had grown up around wise guys, sat at tables where business was spoken in coded language, and watched the way violence shaped loyalty. By the 1970s and into the 90s, he was fully immersed in the Colombo family, running marijuana operations across Brooklyn and Staten Island, extorting dealers, and building a crew that fed off the same fear-driven economy his father once commanded. But the law eventually caught him. Federal prosecutors pieced together a racketeering case that stretched across murders, conspiracies, and drug operations. He was convicted and hit with a 40-year sentence, a term heavy enough to swallow most of a man's life. Prison might have closed the door on some men, but Scarpa Jr. found a strange opportunity behind bars. While housed near Oklahoma City bomber Terry Nichols, he picked up information about hidden explosives Nichols had concealed long before his incarceration. Scarpa Jr. passed the leads to the FBI, and the Bureau followed them straight to a cache of materials connected to the bombing. For a moment, it looked like he'd done something extraordinary, something that might shave real time off his sentence. In 2016, Judge Edward Corman agreed, cutting a decade from his term in recognition of the help he'd given. But nothing in the Scarpa world ever stays simple. The reduction didn't hold. Questions rose about procedure, about the weight of the information, about how the law should treat a man who had committed violent crimes but offered rare intelligence. By mid-2017, the original sentence was reinstated. Whatever hope Scarpa Jr. had of an early release evaporated. He remained, and still remains, a prisoner shaped by the world his father built, then destroyed. A man who learned the rules of the street from someone who broke every one of them. The Scarpa name, once whispered across Brooklyn for its violence, now lived on in court transcripts, prison records, and the long shadow cast by a father whose choices left scars that stretched far beyond his own lifetime.